Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm the Director of the Americas Program at CSIS. Thank you for joining us this morning for the launch of our newest digital report, Tracking Transatlantic Drug Flows Through the Caribbean to Europe. Before we formally begin, let's talk logistics. This event will last approximately 90 minutes. I'll begin with a conversation with Christopher Hernandez-Roy, our Deputy Director and Senior Fellow and co-author of the report, about some of the main takeaways from this report and the process of gathering the data. Then we will go in-depth in this subject with three incredible experts on our superlative panel in the field of drug trafficking and counter-narcotics strategies. Tonya Ayau, Director of CARICOM Impacts, Angela Mee, Chief of Research and Trend Analysis at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and Jeremy McDermott, Executive Director and co-founder of the group Insight Crime. Following the moderated portion of today's discussion, we will answer questions from our audience. Please submit questions by clicking on the Submit a Question link on the event webpage. Chris, I want to start by unpacking certain elements of this really amazing digital report that we've just released, and is now available on our CSIS website under the Americas Program. In it, you and the team sought to highlight the complexity of the cocaine trade towards Europe, passing through the Caribbean, including European overseas territories in the Caribbean. Now, our audience might be familiar with cocaine flowing primarily to the US. Tell me how you would describe the shift to Europe, and what are some of the factors you found to be causing this evolution in the trade?
Sure, Ryan. Thanks very much for the question. Before we get into that, you mentioned I'm the co-author. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my other co-authors, Ruby Bledsoe and Andrea Seren, as well as the team at CSIS's iLab for producing the digital report. To the subject at hand, demand in Europe has definitely grown, and consumption indicators from UNODC, which are primarily in the form of wastewater analysis, has shown that cocaine consumption has gone up by about 50% in the last 6 years alone. One of the reasons that, or a couple of the reasons that Europe is more attractive is that there are larger profits to be made, there is a lower risk for traffickers, and there are lower penalties for traffickers as well. In terms of prices, for instance, some of the data we found shows that a kilo of cocaine might be worth $28,000 to $30,000 in the United States, and that same thing in France or in Spain would be worth almost $40,000, and an astonishing $218,000 in places like Estonia. So really a dramatic rise in profits compared to what traffickers can earn in the United States. And we see this also through seizure data. Seizures in Europe, seizures of cocaine, are definitely increasing. We have a table here that shows both European and UNODC data that shows that from about 2015 or 2016 all the way to 2021, you can see really almost a tripling of seizures. A couple of countries are worth mentioning. For instance, Belgium seized 100 tons of cocaine in 2021, up from about 20 tons back in 2015. And the Netherlands seized about 70 tons in 2021 from about 10 tons back in 2015. And similar trends can be seen in other European countries.
Thanks so much, Chris. Let's talk about the production of coca, which is one of the key ingredients in cocaine. A report by the UNODC shows coca cultivation in countries like Colombia dramatically increasing in 2021, with increases in Peru and Bolivia as well. Yeah, I mean,
Definitely areas, cultivated areas, have grown dramatically since 2012. The White House data, Office of National Drug Control Policy, and UNODC have different methodologies for calculating areas that are under cultivation. We show data here from the White House. UNODC data, for instance, shows an even greater spike all the way to the right, pardon me, in 2021, showing that just in the past 2 years, there's been an almost 41% increase in the area under cultivation. If we shift over to our satellite images, you can see the scale of the change from space. This covers an approximate 18 square mile area, and it shows the changes in the municipality of San Miguel in the province or department of Putumayo in southern Colombia. The river on the bottom of your page is the river of San Miguel, which borders on Ecuador. Ecuador's to the bottom of the page. And this is the changes from 2014 to 2021 as the slider moves over. And you can see dramatically how the area under cultivation has increased. There's been so much increase in cultivation that very recently we've seen actually a decrease in the price of coca leaf, probably because there's been an overproduction of it. I mentioned that this is right on the southern border with Ecuador, and that's particularly relevant because we're seeing cocaine from southern Colombia going to Ecuador and being exported from Ecuador, leading to really an increase in violence and the activities of transnational organized crime in the country.
This is really remarkable satellite data. Shout out to our satellite team here at CSIS. We've been closely following, as you know, Chris, the increased violence in Ecuador, and we'll certainly be looking to analyze the complexities of this issue in the future. Let's pivot towards the actual transportation of the cocaine. Now, there are multiple ways in this report that you and your co-authors outline cocaine being trafficked to Europe. There are multiple ways cocaine is trafficked to the United States, given its relatively close geography to Colombia and contiguous land connections through Mexico and Central America. But South America and Europe are separated by the Atlantic. How is cocaine being trafficked to Europe? What are some of the main transportation methods that you and your team uncovered?
Sure, thanks, Ryan. We looked primarily at cocaine that's being trafficked from Colombia through Venezuela and up through the Caribbean, different routes throughout the Caribbean, and we'll get into that in a minute. But clearly there are many, many other routes for cocaine to reach Europe. And one thing we've learned in the 2 or 3 months that we've been working on this is the moment you think you know something and you think you've identified routes, well, the traffickers are already diversifying their methods of shipping cocaine to Europe. So we're seeing a lot of cocaine going from, say, Peru and southern Colombia into Ecuador, and from there containers shipped directly to Europe. We're seeing cocaine going from Peru and Bolivia overland or by plane into Brazil, and then from Brazil shipped by container either to Europe directly or with stops on the African coast. And increasingly, we're seeing cocaine, again, primarily from Bolivia and Peru, but to some extent also from Colombia, going into Paraguay by little planes, overland, and then using the Paraná-Paraguay or Paraguay-Paraná waterway, major waterway that goes through the southern cone from Paraguay down into Argentina and Uruguay and shipped out through those countries' major ports to Europe and to other destinations. This primarily is done, the largest amount of cocaine is always shipped through containers. We have a visualization here of one of our containers, and we've filled it with bananas, which seem to be a preferred method of concealing cocaine from Ecuador. But not necessarily directly to Europe. It can also be concealed in other cargoes through the Caribbean. The containers have different parts of them. The cocaine can be concealed in the lining of the walls. It can be concealed here in the refrigeration units. They're really quite inventive. In addition to being concealed in the legitimate cargo that is being transported in the container.
This is really remarkable. This is one of my favorite graphics in the report, and for those of you who are accessing the report online, you can actually go into the container and see some of the innovative places where traffickers are hiding some of the cocaine. Now, are these shipping containers sailing directly from South America to Europe?
No, so as we've seen, or as the focus of our study was really the routes that are going from Colombia, mostly through Venezuela, and then through the Caribbean, whether it is the part of the Caribbean that is still part of the South American landmass, or what most people understand as the islands in the Caribbean, or the Antilles. And we'll show a couple of sequences here. One method is what we call island hopping, where cocaine from Colombia is transported through Venezuela, and then on little go-fast boats to some of the islands just offshore from Venezuela, including Trinidad and Tobago. And then go-fast boats or fishing vessels take the cocaine up in a series of stops through the Antilles. And one of the major destinations is the Dominican Republic, which has large ports and is close both to the United States, but is also, because of its ports, is a good shipment point for containers bound for Europe. Another route, and these are just emblematic of, that there's multiple possible routes, but another one is through the various European possessions that are in the Caribbean, whether they are French territories, British territories, or Dutch territories. In the case here, we're showing cocaine that's, again, coming from Colombia through Venezuela, overland, or again by fast boats through Guyana, through Suriname, and reaching French Guyana, which is an interesting territory. It's an integral part of France, kind of like Hawaii is an integral part of the United States. It is like Hawaii is a U.S. state, French Guyana is a French department. It's also part of the European Union. So there are certain advantages. There's common language with Europe, there's a common currency, there's connections, there's family, there's transportation, and in fact, cocaine leaving French Guyana either by container or on mules, which are people carrying cocaine on their person, is responsible for as much as 20% of the cocaine reaching France. Other routes through European possessions, for instance, Aruba and Curacao, which are independent countries, but they're part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They're also very, very close to the Venezuelan coast, and from there they can be cocaine can be shipped either by container or other ways directly to Europe, or again through the Caribbean. And finally, we'll mention just briefly some of the British possessions, the Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Montserrat. They're also possible transshipment points, again, because they have connections with the mother country. In our research, we didn't find open source examples of actual seizures coming from those countries directly to Europe, but there was a major seizure of cocaine bound for the United States, and in fact, the governor of the British Virgin Islands was in fact indicted, as well as the port director, for being directly involved in those shipments.
So these are fascinating discoveries. This is how the cocaine gets from South America through the Caribbean to Europe. Now let's talk about what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Where is the cocaine arriving?
Right. So as I've said, it's arriving by plane, it's arriving by container, it's even arriving, and you can see in this picture, by homemade or homemade narco subs. They're vessels that are converted to be semi-submersible, and it's arriving by other sailing vessels as well. It's the major amounts of cocaine, though, because it's easier to transport these large amounts in containers, is arriving in the major European ports. We looked at 5 European ports. There are many others. We looked at Algeciras in Spain, Valencia, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Le Havre in France. But Hamburg in Germany is also a major point, so as Gioia Tauro in Italy. All of these ports have shown, as you can see in the graph here, a dramatic increase in the amount of cocaine being seized, which is really indicative more of an increase in the amounts that are being trafficked, rather than in a dramatic increase in the capacity of these of the authorities in these ports to seize more drugs. Trafficking organizations who have their personnel, their counterparts, their operations in Europe, they try to corrupt, bribe, or intimidate port workers to be able to access the containers once they've arrived. And what's interesting is, as European ports have recognized that they're being used increasingly to traffic large volumes, they tighten their security, and then traffickers quickly adapt and find other European ports, maybe not some of the biggest ports, but other ports where they're not expecting shipments to come either directly from South America or from the Caribbean. So they're always looking for vulnerabilities and opportunities to shift where the cocaine arrives in Europe.
Chris, you've talked about increased consumption in Europe, which I would imagine has a series of negative health consequences. What effects is the trade having both in Europe and in the Caribbean?
Right. Well, as many of our listeners might imagine and may have seen, the effects of the drug trade in the United States, the similar things is happening in Europe and in the Caribbean. In European port cities, there's been an unprecedented wave of violence, with journalists who are investigating and writing about this being targeted and being murdered. In some cases, lawyers are being assassinated. Sometimes innocent bystanders are caught in the middle and are killed. We've seen port workers extorted, and some of them have actually been tortured and murdered for maybe wanting to resist the entreaties of drug trafficking organizations and getting these people to help them extract their cocaine from ports. The profits are in the billions, and this money needs to be laundered. It's laundered in Europe. It's laundered in a number of places, and that large amounts of money sloshing around, I should say, in the economy has definitely a corrupting influence as well. As drug use has gone up, so have the negative health effects, including overdoses and overdose deaths. In the Caribbean, we see similar trends, increasing violence, and in some of these countries which have, not all of them of course, but some of them that have a slightly more vulnerable democracies, we're seeing destabilization because of increasing corruption, and of course, particularly in the Caribbean, with increasing violence comes the increasing need to have weapons of violence. So we're seeing arms trafficking, a good part of it coming from the United States into the Caribbean as well.
So finally, Chris, let's talk about what can be done about all of this. So what can we do to prevent cocaine from being shipped through the Caribbean to Europe? Let's talk about some of the solutions and how to lessen some of the corrosive impacts that you just discussed.
Sure. I think the best thing we can hope for is really to lessen the amount of cocaine flowing from South America to Europe. We need to do what we've called build, on the one hand, bridges and barriers. And the bridges are really increased international cooperation between European authorities, Caribbean authorities, of course South American and authorities from the United States. The bridges really are increased training of port workers, increased training of police in the Caribbean, better coordination among the interdiction agencies, increased intelligence sharing, which of course can only really be based on increased confidence, increased vetting. And on the barrier side, increased interdiction capabilities. So providing Caribbean nations with more vessels, aircraft, providing them with radar, basically capabilities that allow them to have better domain awareness. And then having Caribbean countries work more closely with European navies that operate in the region because they have possessions, with the U.S. Coast Guard. In fact, the Royal Canadian Navy is also sometimes supporting those efforts. So really building an infrastructure that makes it much more difficult for traffickers to use the Caribbean as a route to access Europe.
Thank you so much, Chris. For more, the white paper, Building Barriers and Bridges, the Need for International Cooperation to Counter the Caribbean Europe Drug Trade, that was published in July. and that can be found on our CSIS website. In addition to this digital report, that piece that you co-authored, Chris, is chock full of solutions. So this presents a very complex situation for Europe. This report is really remarkable in what it manages to highlight and to trace. In order to dig a little bit deeper into some of these topics and into some of these themes, I want to begin our portion of the panel. Our first panelist is Tonya Ayau, a national of Trinidad and Tobago. She's the director of CARICOM Implementation Agency for Crime and Security, IMPACS. Ms. Ayau has over 17 years of experience within the CARICOM region. As director, IMPACS, she works with the executive director on matters related to resource mobilization, identification, and pursuit of cooperation and collaboration with traditional and non-traditional partners. And most recently, she has been tasked with supporting the development of CARICOM IMPACS maritime capacity and the implementation and introduction of passenger name record data, which is crucial in the counter-narcotics strategy. Ms. Ayau began her CARICOM career at the CARICOM Secretariat, where she spent 5 years before subsequently joining in April 2018. Our second panelist is Jeremy McDermott. He's co-founder and co-director of Inside Crime. Jeremy has more than 2 decades of experience reporting from and around Latin America. He's a former British Army officer who saw active service in Northern Ireland and in Bosnia. Upon retiring from the military, he became a war correspondent covering the Balkans, based in Bosnia, then the Middle East from Beirut, before being sent to Colombia to cover the conflict there. He co-authored the report, The Cocaine Pipeline to Europe, as well as Venezuela, a Mafia State, which includes the feature Dominican Republic and Venezuela, Cocaine Across the Caribbean. Before setting up Inside Crime, Jeremy worked for many of Britain's most prestigious media outlets, including the beloved BBC, the Daily Telegraph, and The Economist. And our third panelist is Angela Mee, Chief of Research and Trend Analysis at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. At UNODC, she oversees global, regional, and national research in the areas of drugs and crime. She is responsible for global reference research publications such as the World Drug Report, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, the Global Study on Homicide, and the World Wildlife Crime Report. She has supported countries to improve their statistical analysis systems, and she has authored, contributed, and supervised the production of UN analytical reports, international statistical standards, discussion papers, and the intergovernmental documents in the areas of drugs, crime, population, gender, disability, and migration. So I think it's safe to say that we have assembled truly a superlative panel this morning to discuss the topic of this great digital report. Ms. Ayau, over to you for your opening remarks.
First of all, thank you very much for having me on this distinguished panel, and congratulations to Chris and his team on that white paper, that publication, which is an excellent publication, and is seeing it there made me realize I see this daily. I see some of these statistics. I see the movements daily, and seeing it on paper still jars me even today. I want to address a couple of things with respect to the paper and addressing the movement of drugs through or cocaine primarily, through the Caribbean to Europe. One of the things COVID taught me was that while the rest of the world was struggling to be resilient, that the criminal organizations really led the way in that they were resilient. They knew exactly how to continue moving their product, albeit illicit, with very little interruption. And so while air traffic would have reduced significantly in the Caribbean during COVID, what we realized is in that the maritime domain that things remained busy. I should put it like that. And that the movement of drugs reduced very little, if at all, during that time. But it also brought to the fore a number of issues that we in the Caribbean have been speaking about for quite a bit of time. And that is issues of capacity, issues of corruption, implementation of international standards in ports, for example, the ISPS code, and essentially the need for more cooperation. So that we need to be able to cooperate not only amongst ourselves, but with our international partners, whether it be the US, Europe, Africa. And in fact, we've been recently seeing that we even need to increase our cooperation with the Pacific Islands, for example. Given the context that I just gave, I just want to say a bit about impacts. So we're an intergovernmental agency that was established by the heads of government of the CARICOM nations in 2006. And we have primary responsibility for the advanced passenger information system for now 18 states, well, 15 member states and 3 of our associate members. In addition, we've established what is also called the Advanced Cargo Information System, in which there are 7 participating states. And as I gave you the lesson we learned from COVID, we've established a maritime program where we're actually looking at it from the operational sense, where we have introduced a maritime domain awareness platform that allows us to monitor vessels with the automated identification system. This in itself has allowed us to see more, to gather more evidence of as it relates to the movement of cocaine, but also the movement of sanctioned oil, for example, and even as we look at the issue of human trafficking and firearms. And one of the things we like to say is that without that each of those illicit products carries with it the other. So where you find drugs, you find arms. And where you find that, you most likely will find elements of human trafficking or migrant smuggling. And then finally, because I know I have a very short span here and we'll have a wider conversation, what we need to look at the socioeconomic issues. So in April 2023, the governments of the Caribbean community started to look at crime as a public health issue. And in doing so, we've had to frontally look at issues related to poverty, because firearms is a really horrendous challenge that we're facing. We're looking at the impact of firearms in the public health system. And although cocaine consumption primarily remains low in the region, we still have to look at the impact of cocaine passing through our region, the violence that it is engendering, and all the other attendant issues such as money laundering. And I think, Chris, you brought up the issue of in Europe, where you talk about the extortion and even the torture of port workers. But in the Caribbean, we do have to look at that issue of corruption, not just, and I'm not singling out anybody, so please don't get me wrong, but we have to look at the issue of corruption at all levels and the weakening of systems that exist to prevent this and to prevent other such challenges. So I think I will stop there for now, so that my colleagues can also speak. And I do know that during this podcast, I can certainly add more in terms of what we're seeing, but I think you have covered the trends absolutely correctly in terms of what we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tonya, for those opening remarks. Jeremy, over to you for your opening remarks.
Greetings from Colombia. Thanks very much, Ryan and Chris, for the invitation. Some excellent work and pushing the envelope on this crucial issue. I'm going to start my comments from here in Colombia, looking at the supply side before looking at the European market. Obviously, as we've already discussed, cocaine production here in Colombia through the roof, but also increases in, much smaller though, in Peru and Bolivia. And for the first time, our investigators have found industrial-sized coca crops in Venezuela, in Guatemala, and in Honduras. The overall message, obviously, there's a bonanza of cocaine. But what's interesting, while Chris mentioned a collapse in prices for coca in Colombia, we haven't seen a collapse in cocaine prices internationally.
Right.
And what this tells us is the problem is getting the drugs out of South America and getting them to the market. This is the bottleneck. It's the roots. And while the US market's pretty steady for cocaine, there's still enormous growth potential in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. And one must remember that Europe is also an important transshipment point for containers going to Asia and other places. So Europe is definitely, I would say, one of the main focuses of South American cocaine drug trafficking organizations, less so the Mexicans. The other thing that's worth highlighting is with the fragmentation of Colombian organized crime, the cartels are a thing of the past, the cartel being a drug trafficking organization that controls production to retail, like Medellin and the Pablo Escobar and the Cali and the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers. Today, we're in a subcontracting and very fragmented world. And what we are seeing increasingly is the South American traffickers don't want to go to the US. They're happy to allow the Mexicans to fight the DEA and the extraordinary resources that US law enforcement dedicates. They're looking elsewhere. And as Chris mentioned, if you're trafficking to anywhere apart from the United States, you're going to get a higher price with less risk interdiction, extradition, and seizure of assets. So the South American traffickers are looking far and wide, diversifying their markets. And then the other thing we're seeing, particularly this year, is a very large number of European traffickers coming upstream, something which would have been unthinkable 15 or 20 years ago, when no one would dare land in Colombia from Europe and hope to score any significant shipments. Now they're being welcomed. Now we're seeing a series of alliances between Colombian and other South American drug trafficking organizations and traditional European mafias, be they the 'Ndrangheta in Italy, the Dutch, the Albanians, the Serbs. So we're going to see Europe grow in importance for transnational organized crime, and particularly the cocaine trade going forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for those remarks. Finally, Angela Mee, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Ryan and Chris, and greetings to everyone from Vienna. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And again, congratulations for the paper, Chris. It's really informative. And shed light on one part of this big trafficking that is expanded in the last decade, I would say. And from a global perspective, the way how we look usually drug markets is to look at through the lens of markets. And so to look at how the different factors of the market being demand, supply, the price, so to triangulate all of this information to understand where a market is going. And in the last few years, is clear the change of this market. And this change has probably started in the early 2010, 2012, 13, where in Europe, the landscape of drug traffic organization, and particularly cocaine traffic organization, has changed. And as Jeremy was mentioning, the monopoly, the quasi-monopoly of the Italian groups, that had the trust of the Colombians, of the Mexican broker. And there has been started to emerge the Balkan groups, and that have entered the business, and so going directly to South America, and so to increase competition in Europe. And so what we have seen in this triangulation of elements, when you see a purity and price, for example, we saw that over the years, Europe started to see exactly as the market in the United States. And so if you want, in the past, the crossing the Atlantic brought more risk, higher price. Now, it started to be, because of this increase of groups that started to get into the market and increase competition. And so also price per purity started to really look in Europe as in the United States. On the other side, so since this started to change little by little the dynamics in Europe, and so after a few years of this supply change, group change in Europe, started to drive a bit of increase in the demand. On the other side, the supply started to change, particularly with the peace agreement. What happened, and again, Jeremy alluded already, the broken of the FARC and the entering of new groups that have, instead of in a way diminishing the market, have amplified and have also made the market a lot more cost effective. So coca cultivation more concentrated and more effective. So more coca produced from the same amount of hectares. And so this has created a spiral. And so if you want a vicious cycle in the market by which more demand calls for more supply and more supply calls for more demand. And that's where we are today. And today we are still into this spiral of increasing on one side, the calls for increase on the other side, and vice versa. And you may have seen last year we have released the latest information on coca cultivation in Colombia, where we have, again, almost a 25% increase in production. So clearly indicating that we are still, in this overall spiral. And so but the story is not limited to Europe, that where clearly the demand is increasing, and you, Chris, showed, but is expanding in other parts of the world. And that is where becoming, in a way, more, or equally or more worrying, because cocaine is reaching Asia. And is targeting the middle class or the high level class that has emerged in the last 2 decades in Asia, and that is a very large number of people. And so if that really market started to establish, that will mean that globally we will have even a further demand for cocaine that could trigger also further supply. So and the same is for Africa, because Africa had a bit from the 2010, there was started to emerge as the transit for cocaine, but then the trafficking started to go down. But now clearly has emerged and never seen so much cocaine going through West Africa and going for Europe. But is not only going for Europe, we have signed that now is also starting to establish some markets, local markets in Africa. So the last thing I wanted to say is actually to follow up on what Tonya mentioned on the impact on the region. And one of the things that we have looked recently is exactly how the impact of the cocaine trade, the cocaine economy is impacting the environment and also the local communities, particularly indigenous community. And so we have done an analysis on the Amazon, and so it's clear that beyond the damage, the direct damage the cocaine cultivation and production could do in the environment, which directly is not a lot in terms of deforestation, but where is the main concern is in the direct impact that this is bringing, because there are large communities where there is a concentration, equally as Tonya was mentioning, a concentration of crime that is triggered by the cocaine economy. And so wildlife crime, illicit mining, illicit logging, that is definitely damaging not only in a way communities, but also the environment. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Angela, for those opening remarks.
Thank you, Angela, as well, and it's good to see you again. From your perch at UNODC, where you look globally, I want to drill down a little bit on Europe, not just as a destination, but as you've begun to explain, and as Jeremy mentioned, and even Tonya was talking about the need for CARICOM impacts to coordinate with the Pacific Islands. How can you drill down a little bit more into how Europe is now also becoming a transshipment point to other parts of the world? Is the cocaine coming into Europe and then simply going straight to other places, maybe not even leaving the container that it was shipped to Europe? Or is it now going into Europe and finding overland routes to Eastern Europe and points beyond? Or is it, again, a question of using containers from Europe to Asia, to Australia, et cetera?
Thank you, Chris. Well, one caveat, I think, to answer to your question is that with the increase of containers trade, it's difficult now to establish routes, specific routes, because, you know, container ships go from one port to another, and where it sees doesn't mean that that is the last destination of the container. And so clearly there is still a lot, and the majority, the majority of seizure still happens in South America. And actually is remarkable how, in a way, the weight of the global cocaine market is still, you know, on the shoulder, or the bigger shoulder of the law enforcement in the region, and together with all the other impact, you know, that cultivation has in the communities. So, but the main is much more seized in Europe that is in our region, Asia and Africa. But this doesn't mean that the consignment is meant to stop there. And as you mentioned, the Eastern Europe, and definitely that is the new destination that we see where, you know, is expanding not only through, for example, the port of Constanța, is becoming, you know, a port of Turkey that before, in a way, there was very little cocaine trafficking, now has become a major destination trafficking routes for other, both for Asia and for Eastern Europe. So clearly, that is something that we are monitoring, and definitely, as you say, and also Jeremy mentioned, you know, Europe is emerging as a transit rather than just a destination.
Angela, the 2023 Global Report on Cocaine highlights that coca and cocaine production in South America continues to increase. Jeremy commented on this in his opening remarks as well. And we also have seen a rise in consumption in Europe after a lull during the initial COVID outbreak. Is this increase in production due to higher demand or higher interdiction? And also just reporting in the Guardian newspaper, I believe, that coca leaf prices in Colombia and other places have plummeted. And again, this is something Jeremy commented on in his remarks. Has there been overproduction of coca leaf?
Well, that's a good question. Again, Jeremy has already commented on it. Well, and I also, you know, whether there is always this issue that when you ask source countries, they say, well, you know, it's because there is high demand. Then when you discuss this with destination countries, say, oh, but because there is high supply. And the conclusion is that they are both. And as I said earlier, you know, it has been a combination of dynamics at both sides that they played in changing the dynamics of the market, but also that they are still playing. And what is worrying, as I was saying, is that indeed, if new demand the market established, particularly in this large region, that means that then it will call definitely for more production. And so looking at the number globally, in terms of global number of users and potential number of users, if this, you know, this threat become a reality, definitely demand will call for more production. But you mentioned also the seizures, and again, globally, what we can see is that with the increase of production, also the interdiction has increased. But has also increased faster than the production, meaning that law enforcement have kept pace with this increase, and they even, seizure more than they were before. And if there had not been this increase in the interdiction, we would have even today much more cocaine available for use around the world. So the question is also increasing on seizure calling for more supply? That's, again, a valid question if you have an established demand that is, again, calling for supply. And so interdiction, in a way, would only trigger increase in the supply.
Jeremy, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that the days of the Colombian cartels, like the Medellin cartel, are long gone, and that European organizations are coming upstream directly into Colombia to source their drugs. Are we seeing now basically a change from Colombian cartels to European cartels? Are there European cartels controlling the trafficking through the Caribbean as well? What is the landscape of the criminal groups that are operating in the Caribbean and sending their drugs, cocaine in this case, to Europe? What specific organizations have you identified?
I think, Chris, we've got to be careful now when we look at the cocaine trade to think of it just in terms of ethnic or national groups. What we found during field investigations when we're kind of following the cocaine from field to destinations in Europe, in each link or in each leg of that journey, you're likely to have at least 3 nationalities in the room. And this will be a Latin group, be it Colombian, Peruvian, that is the initiator and owner of the shipment on the production side. We will then have the transporter, who could be from a variety of nations. You've been talking a lot about the Caribbean. We're seeing a lot of Venezuelan groups and Dominican groups, for example, involved in handling those shipments. And then you'll have the European in the room, who will be in charge of receiving the shipment and then selling it wholesale in Europe. So I think we need to stop talking about cartels, and we need to start talking about criminal networks. And the constellations and nodes that these criminal networks have. And what we find increasingly that even when you take down a major trafficker today, it's having very little effect on the flow of cocaine because the criminal constellation and networks simply realign and somebody else steps into that particular role, that node that's been removed out of the constellation. So, but in general terms, the Colombians, for me, have always been the pioneers. A lot of attention gets paid to the Mexicans now. The Mexicans dominate the US market. And they only have one competitive advantage in the cocaine world, and that is the border they share with the United States. So the Colombians in particular have been developing new markets. It's not just Europe. We're seeing a lot of Colombians moving stuff to Australia. Here in Medellin, I've got a couple of contacts that keep talking about the Chinese market. And all you've got to do is recruit 0.01% of the Chinese middle class, and you've got yourself the biggest market in the world, haven't you? So there's a lot of thinking outside the box here in Colombia amongst some of the Colombian top-level drug traffickers. But perhaps one of the most dangerous things in this European-Latin tightening alliance is not simply the cocaine flow to Europe. These criminal structures have reach in many different parts of the world. And when you put Ndrangheta and Colombian drug trafficking organizations with decades of experience into the same room, and they start planning expansion together. These are the sort of criminal alliances that can move cocaine pretty much anywhere across the globe.
I noticed Tonia was nodding in agreement. She seems to have direct knowledge of some of the things that you've been talking about. Tonia, would you like to take a stab at that answer as well, or that question, I should say?
Certainly, thank you very much. And yes, I do agree with Jeremy that we need to stop talking about cartels and we need to start talking about criminal networks. So, for example, one particular operational trend that we've been seeing with these networks, the drugs are coming out of Peru, Ecuador, or Colombia from those ports. By the time the shipment reaches the Caribbean, we start seeing a switch of crew. And the crew usually reflects what is going to happen with the shipment. So, for example, you talk about the Turkish networks or you talk about the Italian networks. We see where the crew changes to a specific nationality, and then we say, okay, why is this crew switching out here? And usually when we start to target that, we start to see, you can almost be assured that if you track that vessel and it is, you do the surveillance, that it will have something on it for a particular market. But I also want to say something, we're underestimating what is going through Africa. We are seeing not only changes of routes in the maritime domain, but we're also seeing mules. So mules traveling through the Caribbean over to Europe, but we're also seeing the persons being recruited in the Caribbean to move down to South America and then over to Africa. And that in itself, we have to look more at as well. And I think Angela said it best. If these networks are resilient, you can't pinpoint one trend or another. It's multiple fronts you're looking at. It's multiple trends you're looking at. Multiple movements you have to continuously be looking at. And that in itself makes it difficult for Caribbean nations that are small, that have limited human resources and limited capacities. And that is, to me, the biggest issue that we're facing in the Caribbean, because these networks have, they're operating on multiple fronts, and they have made it very complex for places that have limited capacity at this point in time. Thank you.
Tonia, I want to come back to you because in your opening remarks and just now in your answer, you also mentioned capacity, limited capacity, and in your opening remarks, you mentioned corruption as two issues that prevent the Caribbean from greater interdiction, greater efforts against drug trafficking. So go a little deeper and address how does the issue of corruption, both within governmental institutions and law enforcement agencies, affect the efforts to combat cocaine trafficking in the Caribbean? What measures are being taken to address and prevent corruption in this context?
So I would like to say from the onset that the corruption isn't unique to the Caribbean. And so you have to look at it from all sides. The corruption definitely exists at the ports in the European nations or in the African continent. And along the chain of activities, there will always be persons or systems that are compromised. That is just the nature of the beast. That is how these networks are able to move their product. Now, that's not me saying that it doesn't exist in the Caribbean. It does. So how do you minimize it? We have been actively promoting the need to have vetted units, for example, within law enforcement, whether it's within the police, within the military, within immigration, customs. That is something I think Angela and they at UNODC have done effectively through AirCop and the Container Control Program. You also have programs like CCOP that are actually promoting this use of vetted units in the region. But I also think that the region has taken some good steps in fighting corruption, whether it is through the strengthening of some of the institutions, strengthening of processes, and again, UNODC does a fantastic job in that through their anti-corruption unit. But I always say that with all the best systems in the world, one human can take down an entire system. So you can put all the best technology, all the best systems, the best border security system, the best intelligence system in the world. But if you have a corrupt element in there, that is going to weaken your entire chain that is working against this issue. So for us, it primarily remains working with vetted units for now. Now, let me mention something here. How do you easily compromise people? And that has to be the question we're asking. Where we have potentially underpaid law enforcement officers, people who are not earning sufficient to live on a monthly basis, and to have certain comforts. We all have to eat, we all have to mind our children, we all have to pay a mortgage at some point. And if you don't provide these enough for law enforcement officers to afford these basic things, you are always going to be in a position where persons can be compromised, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's customs, whether it's within your government services, etc. So I think these are the things that we have to look at in order to address the issue of corruption. It has to be a systemic approach to this issue. Thank you.
So as we've seen, the trafficking organizations are looking to expand globally, frankly. Wherever there's a new market, wherever there's an opportunity to earn more money, they're finding those opportunities. At the same time, Jeremy, you said something very interesting in your opening remarks, I think it was, that they're also looking to find new places to plant coca. You mentioned Guatemala, you mentioned Honduras, I think you mentioned Venezuela as well. Coca leaf has, for the longest time, really been confined to the Andean region for the most part. How is it able to now grow in these other areas? Is this a different plant? Is it being modified some way? Are there other factors at play, or is it just simply finding new areas where law enforcement is weak enough that new fields can be planted with coca leaf?
A lot of moving parts to that question, Chris. Obviously, in Venezuela, the conditions are absolutely the same as in Colombia, the topographical and climatic conditions. So absolutely no. Perhaps the big surprise is, why have we not seen coca grown before in Venezuela, and particular Ecuador, yeah. Which again has exactly the same conditions. But what we have found over the years, particularly from the mid-90s to mid-2000s, and especially actually when the American Aerial Eradication Program really began to kick in, with the aerial spraying of coca crops. We saw coca crops atomize because a spray plane needs a target of 4 to 6 hectares. So surprise, surprise, the traffickers worked this out quite quickly, and there were no fields more than 4 to 6 hectares. And they began to move to different parts of Colombia, particularly to the lowland areas, which are also useful because they're near the Pacific coast, the departure points. and Colombia's eastern plains. And yes, you're right, they did mix some of the strains, the traditional strains that they had in Colombia with the Tingo Maria from Peru. And the coca was able to move lower and lower off the Andean hillsides until now it's pretty much grown at sea level. And this is why Honduras and Guatemala have the same very humid tropical conditions, and we're seeing it begin to take root there. It's a very small scale at the moment, Chris. We mustn't talk this up, and it's not like Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia are not producing enough cocaine to feed the current market and then some. But what it does mean is the extraordinary dangers associated with coca crops taking root in your country. Now, you mentioned Ecuador. We're doing a lot of work in Ecuador. Ecuador's just a transit nation, and look what's happened there. How to do an investigation on Costa Rica, because we're seeing the same sort of dynamics again. Any nation that becomes a major transit nation is going to face sophisticated transnational organized crime, corruption, and violence. And then if you throw coca crops in there as well, it's like, okay, this is the perfect criminal storm. And we've seen how hard Colombia has been working to eradicate coca and deal with the supply side, billions of dollars of US aid, which has unfortunately been a total failure by any measurement. So we're looking at the planting of coca crops not simply as a supply side issue, but as a general criminal dynamic. It's a criminal game changer and a huge red flag for us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Angela, analysis by the EMCDDA last year revealed that cocaine processing is now taking place inside Europe, mainly in Belgium, Spain, and the Netherlands. How does the diversification of criminal groups impact the supply chain of cocaine? And do you see, or do you foresee rather, more production shifting to Europe itself?
Well, before I answer your question, I am sorry, but I have the sun right in my face, and it's not easy to find the spot. But if I just follow up on this new area.
Go ahead, please.
And talks about really a foresight. Surprisingly, one region where there has been, in the very, very long past, coca cultivation has been Indonesia, and particularly in Java. So if we see really an Asian market expanding, we should also think about where in Asia maybe we could start seeing cultivation. But that's, again, it's just to see, to have a foresight on what may happen around the world. On the production of cocaine, you're right that in the last few years, we have been seeing an increase of seizure of coca base in Colombia. And so there has been always this question and say, so where is that the process is going to be finished? And then it is indeed that now in Europe, there is also some labs that have been discovered in the process, the last process of the cocaine production. And there is also another element that is emerging in the use market in Europe, and is the use of crack cocaine. That again, before or in the past, not really maybe some marginalized populations like sex workers or etc. But this is really, again, rapidly expanding. And so treatment centers started to see people coming because of the use of crack cocaine. That is, again, is relatively new, not in Latin America, but in Europe. In large scale is relatively new. So whether this is could be an expansion is definitely something to monitor. And I would say not only in Europe, but also in Africa, where you may have areas where it may be easier, to find areas where to finish the production. But also, as I was saying, even outside of these two traditional regions.
Tonya, with the advancement of technology, drug traffickers have also developed innovative ways to, to further their criminal activities. But technology can go both ways and can play a significant role in interdiction efforts and, perhaps more importantly, in efforts to enhance the security of ports and airports. How can technology best be used to counter drug trafficking through Caribbean ports, for instance?
A very good question. I don't know if I can give you a perfect answer or an answer at all. I mean, there has to be this is what we've been advocating for again. Let me just put it this way, that we have to look at our ports. We have to look at where the gaps are. In many cases in the Caribbean, we have not fully implemented the ISPS code for the ports. In terms of technology, some countries are more proficient in the use of technology than others. They have more stable internet, for example, than others. In some countries, they have enabled police or customs or to use more technology than others. So for us, we would need to do a gap analysis, a really good, sound gap analysis to be able to answer that question perfectly and to give you some sound information. But what I can say to you, that as a region on the whole, we have started to implement to make sure that there's a harmonized approach. And we have started to implement different measures. So even from as far back as 2006, when we implemented the advanced passenger information, many countries have then moved on to border management systems. What we do have to look at is our technology in terms of communications. How do we better communicate with each other, not just by telephone? An email is not always the most sound way to communicate, but it's sometimes the only way we can communicate with our counterparts. Because again, there isn't harmonization in that area. We've actually, with the implementation of our maritime domain awareness, there has been some work with elements of UNODC, for example, who have introduced Skylight, for example, to the countries to assist them in also tracking vessels. But again, that's just but one part of it. So we've been doing things, everybody's been doing something, but what we really need to do is sit as a law enforcement community, an international community, and do a proper gap analysis, needs assessment, on how we move forward with the proper implementation of technology and capacities in the region to fight cocaine trafficking.
Tonya, can I just follow up with a bit of a collateral from technology to actual cooperation? Can you describe impacts coordination and work with your European counterparts, for instance, the Maritime Analysis Operations Center, as well as the U.S. or the multinational U.S. Counterpart, the Joint Interagency Task Force South that's operated out of Florida?
Thank you, Chris. So I'll start with the European side of things. Because we have grown, Impacts has grown exponentially, I would say, in the last 5 to 7 years, where we've actually improved our systems, increased the number of systems, the number of nodes, the number of countries that are on the system. And because of that, we're able to have a bird's eye view of what is happening in the region in terms of whether it's firearms trafficking, whether it's movement of persons, and also drug trafficking. And as a result, we have been able to reach out to our counterparts and our counterparts to us in terms of improving the information and intelligence sharing. I think MAOC is one of our best partners in terms of that consistent and constant exchange. This is what we're seeing in the region. It's coming over to you because, hey, our countries can't deal with it at this point in time, but we know that the destination is Europe. We send that over to them. And because of that, we have seen some crucial successes. In terms of Europol, and so we are yet to get there because, again, the European process can be a bit long and convoluted at times. And I'm not saying that in any disparaging way, but again, to be able to share, you have to go through this process. So we are not there yet with like the agencies such as Europol and Frontex. But with MAOC, we are getting there. But I have to say that most recently in the Caribbean, and I think it was Jeremy, you brought it up, the movement of Europeans into our market to get things going. And so we are seeing that Europeans definitely moving and also bringing out or being mules or doing the trafficking. And so we've had to reach out country by country because where your nationals are involved, we will have to reach out. Is it smooth? Not always, but we're getting there. In terms of the US, we have a very good relationship with Joint Task Force East, with JIATF South. We're still working to get to the promised land in terms of cooperation, but we're getting there. And we have, we're starting to establish relationships with other entities. Again, not always smooth, but I think that once you keep working at it, we're small. The Jamaicans have a saying, we're little, but we're Taloa, meaning that we're little, but we can produce good things. And we think that once we continue doing the work that we do and improving the way we've been doing, we will get to that increased cooperation that we are aiming for.
Very good.
So I'm conscious of the time. We have about 15 minutes before our event this morning closes. I think the report and a lot of the comments here have painted somewhat of a grim picture. And I want to have us turn the conversation to some proactive steps that we can take to tackle transatlantic trafficking from South America through the Caribbean and to Europe. And in particular, I'll ask each one of you to reflect for a couple minutes only on things that the international community can do, or perhaps bring a particular attention to the role of civil society and perhaps even the private sector. And Angela, I'll start with you and then go to Jeremy and then finish with Tonya.
So in two words, from the international perspective, I think what we could do is, first of all, to support international cooperation. Okay, this is the rhetoric that we have, but in particular is building the trust among the law enforcement communities. When you talk to the law enforcement community, you clearly, they tell you that the difficulties of sharing intelligence and information, particularly because of the issue of corruption, of not trust across the country, and this is hampering a lot on the on the fight, particularly on the interdiction of cocaine trafficking, but of course also on the side of the demand, and so particularly on the prevention and particularly on the risk that of cocaine, but drugs in general, that clearly is diminishing across all the young population, I would say, starting from the West, but not only, and now is spreading also in the South of the world.
Thank you very much, Angela. Jeremy?
Yeah, I guess coming from an NGO, I'm always keen for civil society to speak to each other. And I would quite like to see the ports directly speaking to each other without having to go through law enforcement. This is part of the tracking dangerous, red flag containers, sharing information on the movement of containers, because as Angela said, there is the container can go through 15 different ports on its way to the final destination market, whatever that might be. And at the moment, the focus is on the departure points in Latin America, which for the most part are containers, although there is some yachts and there are the semi-submersibles, there's some air to Africa that Tanya's already alluded to. But let's say 70 or 80% is going via containers. So if we want bang for our buck, let's get the ports talking to each other, sharing information in real time without it having to become an intelligence issue going through multiple different intelligence agencies, which tends to be, unfortunately, slowing things up rather than increasing agility.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That's great. Tonya?
For me, the issue of building capacity, and it's something I'd like to see more of. I know, Chris, you mentioned in the beginning about boats and radars, and all very good suggestions, but we need to build the human capacity. And one of the things I say to entities such as UNODC and the Interpols and the WCOs that run the global programs, always make sure that you include your regional operators and your national operators in your plans, because at the end of the day, when the projects are finished, the sustainability is important, and sustainability can only be reached if you build capacity in the regions. So I think for me, that is a critical part of the cooperation, whatever exercises, whatever operations, make sure and include the regional entities, but also look at the sustainability of what you're doing. As I mentioned, in terms of the international cooperation, we're getting there. But again, it's slow in coming. Perhaps what we need to do now, and I hope that the right bodies are listening in, we really need to take stock, because again, the resilience of these networks that we're speaking about today, the resilience is there. And we need to be more resilient. We need to be more cooperative. We need to be more proactive. So I think that, in a nutshell, is what I would like to add at the end of this podcast.
Thank you very much, Tonya. We have about 11 minutes left, and we did promise a section of this event for Q&A. Again, if you've got a question, a few of them have filtered in already. Go to the event webpage, click on the live questions button, and input your question. Chris and I have access to those questions here on our phones. That's why we've got our phones out at the moment, and it looks like we've got a couple questions in the queue for our panelists.
Thanks, Ryan. Our first question, directed at anybody who would like to take it. Is the market shift we're seeing from the U.S. to Europe a confirmation that U.S. law enforcement measures are working? What measures should Europe take in order to deter drug traffickers from reaching its ports and airports? Maybe we'll start with Jeremy, who at one point mentioned that traffickers don't really want to confront the DEA.
Yes, obviously the United States is spending far more than probably most of Western Europe combined on counter narcotics. The DEA have missions all the way through Latin America. They have enormous intelligence resources from the military side as well, in terms of monitoring of airspace and that sort of stuff. So yes, I mean, for me, cocaine trafficking is a bit like water. It follows the path of least resistance. And certainly at the moment, there is greater resistance going into the United States, combined with the fact that you're not making as much money. So when you've got high risk and lower reward, it's a bit of a business no-brainer. And this is why, again, I go back to the Mexicans. The Mexicans are fighting the U.S. because, they can't really. They've got no competitive advantage smuggling cocaine to Europe. They don't have a big diaspora like the Colombians or others. There's no. They don't have the raw material. So the U.S. market is a different one than the European, mainly because there's also a land corridor. So there are many more ways to get into the US than there are to Europe. So if the question is, hey, has spending all these billions of dollars fighting the cocaine trade improved the drug situation in the United States? I'm going to go, actually no, because at the moment the story is about fentanyl. Cocaine market has remained relatively stable, whilst other synthetic drugs have increased in their distribution in the US.
The next question is about the diversity of countries impacted by this challenge, from the Andean region, where most of the cocaine production is centered, to the Caribbean, to the European end users. Where do we start? Which countries should be at the top of the priority list for the United States to engage with in countering the challenge of drug trafficking? What type of international cooperation do we need to see in order to tackle this issue effectively? I'd pose this to all of our panelists, but I'd probably start with you, Angela, because you mentioned international cooperation in your response to my last question.
Good question. So I think it depends on what is the harm that you want to reduce. And from what perspective? I mean, if the perspective is from the United States, clearly the priorities are operating in countries where they are transiting to the United States. The Caribbean, but also, of course, Ecuador. I mean, a lot goes to Europe, but also goes to the US. So in terms of the supply, and of course, Mexico. But if we think about more holistically, if I put myself more as an international, I would say let's put the priority where the cocaine has the most harmful impact on people. And in that respect, I would say look at the Amazon, or in areas of the communities in Latin America that are really suffering, particularly border communities. Or in Africa, where if we start to establish a cocaine market where treatment services are much more lacking than both the United States or North America than Europe. So in that sense, in preventing the harm, then probably that's where I would go.
Thank you, Angela. Jeremy, Tonya, would you like to weigh in?
I'll just say one thing. I'm sorry, go on. You go ahead.
First Tonya, and then Jeremy.
Sorry. I agree with Angela. Looking at prevention, if there's no demand, then your supply will follow. And we're seeing an increase in the markets rather than a decrease of markets. And so this is no longer just about the United States. This has to be all of us in fighting with this, because, for example, we're seeing where the Europe and Africa are being used as transshipment points for countries in Asia, and in Asia, the market price is a lot more than it is even in Europe. So again, the fact that it's going to Asia and the fact that it is selling at that high price means that there's a demand. So it's not just about the United States engaging the Caribbean. It's also about Europe engaging the Caribbean, which they have been doing. It's also about Asia and Africa, Asian countries and some African countries coming to the table as well. And also, while we look at the supply, we also have to look at the demand issue and what needs to be done in countries to reduce that demand. What are the public awareness activities? What legislation, etc., etc. So it is a very complex issue. It's just you just can't address it in one manner, and each country is going to have to take stock from the demand side of things, but from the supply side of things, we all have to come to the table and do what is necessary.
Thanks, Tonya. Over to you, Jeremy. I think the person who asked the question was a little bit overwhelmed by some of the presentation today, so where to start?
Okay. First of all, I love the notion of approaching this all through harm reduction. Obviously, I'm only a specialist in Latin America, so I'm going to concentrate my comments on this. First of all, the US comes in for a lot of criticism, very little praise on this. One has to remember that the US has, for quite some time, had a holistic approach to this. And the struggle against counter-narcotics is not restricted to INL and supporting the justice system and eradicating coca crops and that sort of stuff. USAID is also pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into the development of community resilience, crop substitution, economic development, environmental protection in many of the areas that are strategic for the cocaine trade and the actors that manage them. And perhaps as one final thing, it's also worth saying that while Plan Colombia, the US aid package to Colombia, which was initially counter narcotics, and in that sense, unfortunately, has been a terrible failure, was an extraordinary success in the counterinsurgent world, because US aid in no small part led to the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And without US aid, I don't believe they would have negotiated. And that has had a huge effect, not only on Colombian stability and reduction in the conflict, but on the drug trade as well, but from a rather roundabout way. So yes, holistic approach. Yes, please, harm reduction. Yes, please, let's anticipate things. The writing was on the wall in Ecuador 2 years ago. And unfortunately, it took the killing of a presidential candidate for people to wake up and go, okay, now we've got a problem.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I think we have time for one last question, Ryan. Somebody in our audience has directed this specifically at you, Tonya. Could you please discuss how Caribbean forces are combating go-fast boats that are involved in drug trafficking? How can CARICOM impacts partner more effectively with partner countries in the Caribbean? And should there be an acquisition of aerial or maritime platforms by Caribbean islands? This goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier.
Oh boy. Yes. So to the person that asked that, this again, another complex issue. So for example, we have been advocating for vessel management systems. Most of our countries do not employ vessel management systems on the go-fast vessels. And as a result, they can go rather undetected in their movements. Why has this been so? For example, when I speak to colleagues who have been in the business much longer than I have, and I say, well, go on, why aren't we doing this? And they're like, it's not a new concept, Tonya. We've been trying to do this for the last 40 years. But somehow there's a lobby against this. And I'm not only talking about it from a security aspect, I'm talking about it from a safety of life at sea aspect. Because when these vessels go missing, then you have to deploy your Coast Guard to look for them. And because you don't have exact coordinates, this takes longer, etc. So yes, there has to be a regional approach to a vessel management system that allows us to do exactly what we're doing on the AIS platform. We have to improve the radar capacity in member states. Some member states are more advanced than others in this area. And I have to say, I think Jeremy said it, sometimes the US comes in for more criticism than praise. But there is an effort on that side to assist member states with the radar capacity. What we do need to improve, however, is that when the radar capacity is there, that there is sharing with the regional partners as well as with some other international operational partners. And yes, UNODC is already doing it, where they are giving a system that allows for member states to do the tracking of vessels. And where we complement that system is that our system is AI enhanced, and it allows us to do more analysis, etc. But we are working with small states, small economies, small workforces. So it can't just be done in the states. It has to be done as a regional grouping. That's where the power is. That's where when you have that type of cooperation, you get more success. But if you just do it as a state alone, you are just seeing you, and you're not enabling that cooperation. Because again, when we talk about networks, the networks aren't just local. The networks are regional, the networks are international. And so that question that was posed to me, I'm glad it was, because it gives us the opportunity to think about not just the countries, but the regional network and international network that we have to establish all around.
Mm-hmm.
Before we conclude today's event, there is a link at the bottom of the event page in the video description specifically that will redirect you to a survey. Please take a minute after the event to fill it out. It helps us here at CSIS improve our programming and make sure we are having discussions that interest you as an audience and hit on important policy issues. And finally, remember to check out the new digital report, which we previewed today in this event, now live on the CSIS website. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our panelists for such a fruitful discussion. Thank you, Angela Mee of UNODC, Jeremy McDermott of Inside Crime, Antonia Yao of CARICOM Impacts. And many thanks to our production team here at CSIS, Dinesh Matani, Chi Yu, and Eric Ruditsky, who made today's broadcasting possible, as well as to our excellent iLab team in-house that do a lot of the digital features that you will see in this report. This concludes our event this morning. Thank you all very, very much for joining.